said, no. So I just launched quiz 4, and it's a very simple question in a 2-page attached docx or PDF file. Answer the following question. Describe the differing approach to painting by 3 major post-impressionist artists. I modified that question a little bit because it was from the textbook and they wanted 4. I reduced it to 3. And so that is the next quiz. And it's due 1 week from today, 12 p.m., by the way, is noon. So hopefully, if you guys get it in by noon, I can have some time to grade it before we meet at 5 p.m. And so I have some other stuff I wanted to kind of go over to support this question. And so with that, let me make sure I got the right screen share. Yeah, that'll work. And so this is your textbook from Red Shelf, and it's page 860. And at the bottom it says post-impressionism. And so it says here by the mid-1880s, just as impressionist sketch-like, and we've talked about that, gestural sketchy paintings of contemporary life in and around Paris were gaining wider acceptance. A group of younger painters, even some of the impressionists themselves, became disillusioned with impressionism. They felt that in attempting to capture momentary sensations of life and color on canvas, well, we talked about that on Monday. That's why Monet painted haystacks over and over again, gets that momentary light, the sensations of light and color. The Impressionists were sacrificing important elements of traditional painting. So that's where post-impressionist starts on page 860. And we're going to talk about these guys today, and we started talking about them on Monday. We talked about Henri Toulouse-Lautrec and how he did at the Moulin Rouge with that big, long bar on the right, taking up about 25% of that canvas, and how the light was hitting that woman's face with the white makeup and it looked green. That was Toulouse-Lautrec. Now I want to put something on here to kind of qualify this. As I've said many times in here, these movements, these groups of artists are not cut and dry, etched in stone. There's a lot of overlap. And I just read you a statement from the textbook saying that even some of the impressionists themselves turned to other things, post-impressionism. So anyway, first thing we have to do is figure out who were the post-impressionists. And so Toulouse-Lautrec, and we've seen that. Pointillism, color theory, Georges Seurat, Sunday on La Grande Jatte. We talked about this. We said pointillism, 19th century color theory. And we kind of talked about that some on Monday, and that is post-impressionism. And he did this by applying dots of color on the canvas, and that you would have that optical mix of color. Correct? Yes? Yeah. Okay, we're good. So there was a point of here that I didn't mention on Monday. And that is that this kind of optical mix of color is actually the fundamental theory for this screen, for your phone, for television, for, excuse me, for your printer. How many of you have an inkjet or a laser printer? What do you have? You got black, you got magenta, yellow, blue, or what they call cyan. Magenta, cyan, yellow, CMYK. K stands for black. But in proportion, they can make you see any color of the visible spectrum. And why is that? And especially you get older TVs where the pixelation is actually you can pick it out because it's not such high resolution. But bottom line is, that's what pixelation is pointillism into the digital age, into megabytes and terabytes and so on. But the whole thing is put together with those 4 colors. So you don't have a green ink. You got cyan and yellow. You don't have a purple ink. You got cyan and magenta. So on and so forth. And so anyway, most artists during the 19th century understood the concepts of primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and that's what I'm talking about too. Cyan, magenta, yellow. And so anyway, this stuff that we know, and it's really kind of fundamental to painting, about primary colors, secondary colors, all of that stuff. The whole idea of that color theory was being developed in the late 19th century. It's somebody like Seurat who's actually putting it to work. And so we saw that. And let me keep going here. Vincent van Gogh, we saw him. The letters of Vincent van Gogh is a biographical thing. But Vincent van Gogh, Gauguin, post-impressionist. We're going to talk about him more when I get to this PowerPoint. Cezanne, and there's Cezanne. Symbolism. And this starts to be kind of a different thing. So basically, the artists you're going to write about are basically between pages 860 and 870. And that's why I put it down to 3. But I wanted to do this, and this is kind of this is the last page of chapter 28. And Post-impressionism is not a unified style. The term refers to a group of late 19th century artists, including George Seurat, Van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Paul Cézanne. So that's really where you need to focus the answer of your question. And so the second bullet point talks a little bit about what they did. Seurat refined the Impressionist approach to color and light into pointillism. Van Gogh explored the capabilities of colors and distorted forms. Gauguin moved away from Impressionism in favor of large areas of flat color. Cézanne replaced the transitory visual effects of Impressionists with a rigor analysis of lines, planes, and colors. So if that doesn't give you a hint where that answer should be, I can't do any better than that. So Reagan is here. And so anyway, that's what I wanted to point out and how to use this textbook, you know. And so with that being said, here is the quiz as I posted it. And let's get back to Kaylee, what you got?
Sorry. Are we just comparing?
Well, yeah, describe the difference in approaches. So I think that implies something of a comparison, but they all did different things. They approach painting differently. And as I might say here, where are we at? We got to Van Gogh last time. And so I'm going to try to keep talking here from current slide. And I got to make sure we can see this at home. Yeah, good. So anyway, yeah, it is a compare and contrast. And post-impressionism is really kind of a non-movement. It's where people are doing, in a lot of ways, radically different things. And so, as I had said earlier, you can take the first 450 years of the illustrations in this textbook of painting and sculpture and understand that one of the goals they share across centuries and across cultures in Spain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, England, all that, was the idea of making things that look photographic, a better illusion. And what we see here is the systematic dismantling of all of those approaches. They're doing different things. They're actually calling this into question. And I might add that a lot of scholars more and more believe that it had to do as much with the focus on the individual, that the individual's artist's own perceptions, or if you will, making their own statement becomes more important than what other people want the artist to do. Now, if you went to a bishop, he'd be wanting some angels, some Virgin Mary, some crucifixion, stuff like that. We've seen plenty of that. If you went to a king, he would want portraits of himself, his wife, his children, would want maybe even paintings of him leading armies and leading his armies to victory, and so on. But they all had the interference or the influence, or they were all subject to the people commissioning the work. These folks were more or less free agents. They were, if you will, left to their own devices. And so this is where you start to get the idea. They coined the phrase art for art's sake. Not for the sake of government, religion, moral tales about ancient or religious philosophy. No, it's up to the artist. And so that's what Van Gogh brings to the table here. We saw Seurat, we saw Edgar Degas, who could also be included in post-impressionism as well. And if you want to, you can do that, because this composition is not, this is not out of impressionism. And it doesn't, he has a lot of gestural qualities, but this is pastel. So like I say, these groups are not firm. They're not etched in stone, a lot of overlap. This is truly impressionism. Outdoor scenes of contemporary life in and around Paris. Oh, this is it. But Toulouse-Lautrec, definitely post-impressionism, because even though it is the nightlife in Paris, you got all these other things going on, like that green that I was talking about. Pointillism, that's different than impressionism. Van Gogh. Oh, by the way, I got tickets for this thing. I just bought them today. It was extended until May 30th. It's going to stay there. So my tickets are for April 17th. Yeah, 17th, something. Anyway, I'll let you know after I go. But I heard a lot of good things. So that kind of brings us up to this guy here, Paul Gauguin. And what we have here with the life of Van Gogh, and in your textbook, you'll see the letters of Vincent Van Gogh to his brother Theo, and there's some discussion of that in the textbook. What we find here with post-impressionism too is really a greater interest in the lives of the artist. And Van Gogh's life is certainly interesting. It's certainly studied and still being studied and analyzed. And Gauguin fits into that category too. Paul Gauguin was he was an investment broker. He was a banker. He was somebody that made a lot of money in Paris. If he were today, he would be a hedge fund manager. You know, just say it. Made a lot of money, and in his late 20s, decided to give it all up. Left his wife, left his children, got on a boat, went to Panama. Whoa, what was going on in Panama in the 1880s? Just saying. The French were there and they were trying to build the Panama Canal. They couldn't do it. They didn't have the engineering prowess, but they were the first ones to attempt to build the Panama Canal. And he went down there and worked on it, and he liked traveling around, and he became an artist. Kind of a typical 19th century artist life story. Give it up. And so this is vision after the sermon, Jacob wrestling with the angels. And one of the things that Gauguin actually started to key in on in his work were actually two things. One, he was interested in humanity. So you see people in his work all of the time. There are a few, but not many paintings by Gauguin that do not have people, but he's interested in people. Not so much with Van Gogh. Van Gogh's kind of like 50-50. You see a lot of landscapes and you see an occasional person, and sometimes he did portraits. Oh, by the way, this guy here, Anthony Quinn, he plays Paul Gauguin in this film. Gauguin and Van Gogh. Like I said, these guys all knew each other. So he was interested in humanity, and I'll explain a little bit more about that here in a second. And he was interested in color, and in a kind of way that color would symbolize moods, would symbolize ideas. And so here you've got these people, and they're primarily women. And this is from northern France, up in Normandy by Belgium. And at the time, this is how the women of that culture dressed. This was not Paris. It was a much more rural setting. We saw that with Courbet, the burial at Ornans. Kind of interested in how regular, ordinary people live. The Gleaners by Millet. So that is something that's consistent. And the people in this part of France, as I said, it was rural, and it had not been touched by modernism. Modern life passed it by. These people were still living in the way that they had been living for centuries. You would have an American equivalent today, the 21st century. How about people like the Mennonites or the Amish, who kind of reject much of modern life and stick to a more simple, a more rural kind of life? Deeply religious, as these women surely are. And they have the vision of Jacob wrestling with the angel. After the sermon they had just heard about the biblical account of Jacob wrestling with an angel. So it was after the sermon, they see it. So the symbolism here comes in. Look at this color. This is a red brown. Well, this would be hard to find in nature. This is a symbolic color. And if you take a look at much of Gauguin's work from this time, you will see what we would refer to as arbitrary color. one of his famous paintings, and I didn't think about it until I wrote in today. He did this famous painting called The Yellow Christ, where it's a picture of the crucifixion, and it's done in this style, but Christ himself is yellow. And so it's about religion, it's about symbolism. And so here's what Gauguin does finally. As I was saying, he went to Panama, he went to northern France, he was looking for true humanity, true belief systems, true morality, true humanity. And so this is from 1897. What he did was that he got on a boat and went to Tahiti, an island, modern day Polynesia. And it was a French colony. So he's going to a place not unlike Hawaii, middle of the Pacific Ocean, except it's in the South Pacific. And he found this culture and he was fascinated. He spent much of the rest of his life painting scenes from Tahiti. And typically, he asked the question, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And again, as I said just a moment ago, he was interested in humanity. And he thought the people of Tahiti were unspoiled by all of this modern society. They were people living the same way, at least as he saw it, the same way that they had always been living. They had not changed over the centuries. They didn't have the comforts. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have much of anything to do with modern society. And so what he had found here, he thought was an example of how people should really live. And you see, his work will often have women typically just dressed in a loincloth of some sort, but almost always topless. And what was his explanation for this? The idea of modesty is a modern invention. It comes from the Christianity and the church and all of this stuff, so you got to cover up. All of these ideas of morality were invented by religion and religious figures. And so this is, as he would say, this is the way people should live. Now, he didn't really abandon the idea of spirituality, a belief in a God. And in fact, oftentimes you'll see a depiction of a Tahitian god somewhere in his work. But this is Gauguin. And he uses color in a very arbitrary way. He likes the emotional response. He likes the symbolism. And that's Gauguin, post-impressionism. And then we get the fourth guy that's on the list here of certified, agreed upon post-impressionists, Paul Cézanne. So do you find anything unusual about this, aside from the choppy brushwork? Because it is a painting There's no denying that. It doesn't look like a photograph. And in fact, the idea of painting in a photographic manner was all seen as somewhat of a deception. There's a phrase in French called trompe l'oeil, which means fool the eye. And this illusionism that I've been talking about, that have been carried on and practiced for 450 years, was trompe l'oeil, fool the eye. And some of them were really good at it. Mona Lisa by Leonardo, fool the eye. You can see that. You can see that landscape behind the portrait. Believable. It fools your eye, but it does not exist in me. So nobody finds anything unusual about this. Let me point out a few things then. First of all, the way that he's painted this almost appears as though, correct me if you don't see it this way, but it's almost as though that table is tilted up from the back. And it seems like these apples, if this were tilted up, they would likely roll right off the table. See that? Show you something else. Look at how this is painted. As we talked about Bob Ross last time. David had the guy, he had the name, I couldn't think. Bob Ross. Bottom line, he says take your 2-inch house painter's brush, put a little cerulean blue and mix it up with the titanium white and drag it across the top, back and forth of your canvas to paint the beautiful blue sky. Well, look how this is painted. You can see that it's almost as though he painted the bottle and then painted this afterwards. Look at how that sticks out. It doesn't really conform to the old tricks that were developed by the old masters. And in fact, as I said earlier, they were throwing those conventions, those methods, those ways of doing things out the window. And so when asked about that, Cezanne said, well, I just paint it as I see it. And if I'm looking right here, I'll paint this. And then if I'm looking over here, I'll paint this over here. And the idea, the method of painting that way, without that plan that Bob Ross will tell you how to put that painting together, you're just painting it as you're looking at it. This is kind of what you'll get. And that is deliberate. And so this was another way of getting at the truth. Not trying to fool your eye, but put together a painting of a basket of apples and see how these are stacked up. That in a lot of ways doesn't really make any sense. And it's sitting on top of a book. And so what does that mean? It means that if you have a subject like this and you're painting it as you see it, I showed you Monet and the haystacks over and over again. Cezanne painted this. It was outside of his house. He could see it in the distance, Mount St. Victory. But he painted it as he saw it. And so it kind of looks like it's stacked up on top. And in fact, a lot of these Cezanne paintings, they don't conform to the idea of foreground, middle ground, background, sky. They're all painted at the same time and as he's looking at them. And what you get out of this is a sense of flatness. Do you see the flatness in here? Pardon? Kind of, yeah. Well, and you have to look at it relative to a lot of the artists of the day who were creating this illusion, and they would have much more detail, much more information, much more clarity in the foreground. And then the middle ground would be somewhat more clear, but not quite. There would be other factors, the atmospheric perspective, the distance, everything. And then finally, in the far background, you'd have the mountain, and behind that, the sky. If you would happen to see this, and a lot of these don't translate that well as slides, but believe me, I've seen a lot of these, and they are much more flat than anything that we've seen. And that was just okay. This idea of flatness intrigued artists who were coming up right about this time. And chief among them were two Cubist artists, George Braque and Pablo Picasso. And so they were intrigued by the flatness. And Picasso famously said, painting an illusion is painting a lie, and I paint the truth. May not agree with that, but this is how they were thinking. And so this is, sum it all up, flatness. And so here's another Cezanne. And it's kind of handled in the same way. There's a little bit more depth here. He painted bathers, but check out how these trees are. You can see that he actually ended up painting the sky in between the trees after he had painted the trees. And when you see these in life, that actually looks weird. There seems to be a spatial reversal in a lot of his works. But as a result, a lot of this flattens out. I want to point out something else too. This is from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Museum of Art, Philadelphia. Art Institute of Chicago. Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. National Gallery in Scotland. Not American. Museum of Modern Art, New York. So anyway, what I was saying about a lot of the wealth that was being generated in the US at the time, all of these people making tons of money went over there and they bought up a lot of this work. At the time, the French were semi-enthusiastic about this. But the Americans, that's why you find some of the best examples of all of these artists right here. And so there's other things going on, I might add. And there is this idea of symbolism. And there are artists who are still trying to do some of the same things that we've seen forever. Sacred Grove. And this appears to be, we got some angels floating here and one playing a harp, and that is an age-old theme. And the portico, the ancient Greek structure, and all of these figures semi-clad, dressed in togas, if they're dressed at all. The sacred group comes right out of ancient Greece and Rome. Why is this in book? Because there were still people trying to advance some of the traditional ideas, that some of the themes that we found in art. And Gustave Moreau, the apparition, this is where they have a vision of Christ here. Comes right out of biblical themes, but it's handled differently. And that's really what's going on here. This is a traditional scene handled somewhat differently. New ways to depict old things. I'm going to show you this one. This was one that I forgot who it was. Somebody had written about as something that didn't really seem to be pretty odd. There was 3. Cyclops, red on. Again, they've got this sleeping nude, traditional thing. Cyclops, this is out of ancient Greek mythology, the Odyssey. And it's this big monster that had one eye. And it's an ancient theme, but handled in a different way. You see, he's picked up some ideas from some of the post-impressionists and some of the impressionists. So everything is turning. Rousseau, Sleeping Gypsy. And a lot of these artists of the time were considered to be primitive. They were doing ancient themes, and they weren't handling these ancient themes in a traditional manner. And so the kind of the snobbery, the condescending attitude was that these people just didn't know how to paint. But this is actually quite a famous painting, and it is, again, at the Museum of Modern Art. But I'll go back to a point I've been making about photography and stuff. And one of the things that you cannot photograph under any circumstances is dreams. You can't photograph mythology. You can't do ancient gods. You can't photograph apparitions. So anyway, that's really kind of an underlying theme that's driving Impressionism. It's driving post-impressionism, and it's driving symbolism. Henri Rousseau, the dream. And so this is kind of a theme in his work, the sleeping gypsy. Not only have the sleeping gypsy, but what's happening in her dream. There she is, again, in the jungle, in the dream, the lions, the snakes, the rhinoceri, same. And so, Christ's entry into Brussels. This is kind of a strange painting, I think. Let me zoom in on parts of this. So what we have here is a kind of a, what looks like a Mardi Gras. And over here, where's Christ? There's the halo coming in on the donkey, just like Palm Sunday. but it's set in a modern time and the kind of modern revelry we've seen. This is really getting, as they would say, out of the lane, off of the reservation. And so what you have here, in a lot of respects, is this kind of painting that's fantastic. Only in your dreams would something like this happen. And if you would imagine, you would think about Christ, everything that you know about Christianity, how Christ rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on a donkey, and he was just greeted with all kinds of warmth and enthusiasm. What would that look like today in 1889? And so they take a lot of other cues here. This is not particularly photographic. A lot of color that is discordant. A lot of color that's really kind of excites the senses. In fact, it's kind of agitated to some extent. And so that is what's going on. Aubrey Beardsley, the Peacock Sheriff. There's another strand of art making that happens at this time too. And this is called Art Nouveau, the new art. And it kind of drifts into illustration. And it comes in at a new way on a new level. And so Peacock Skirt illustration, pen and ink illustration for Oscar Wilde Salome. So it's a book illustration, but the style, ornate, decorative, what we have here at the time, along with all of this other stuff, is an arts and crafts movement. And so I will kind of jump from that to this. And this is arts and crafts movement. This is where you see the invention of the Tiffany eggs and a lot of ornate architecture. Castle House Brussels. Check this out. This is all decorative. Decoration takes a turn at this time. Green dining room. Decorative. Their whole idea of design starts to really spread. Okay, so how many of you have seen this painting anywhere? Yes, good. Got some hands. The scream. Oh no. Edward Munch. A lot of scholars talk about Edward Munch as the guy who pushed Van Gogh's ideas farther. Can you see that? See the brushwork? You can see how the sky is undulating. Think of the starry night with the fireballs. This is a sunset here, and you can see it's not a tame sky. It's very active. We see the ocean and the bay here. And this is all, it's all conforming to the forces of nature, just like the starry night. And you see this figure, the scream, and we see a couple of anonymous figures, menacing figures on what is likely a pier, a structure that goes out into the water. And so we see the gesture, we see the hands on the side of the face, and it's almost as though the hands have shaped the face, as though it were pliable. But the idea of the scream, of the horror, of being frightened, deathly frightened, and all of this distortion. He's taken that to a new level. And so there has been a lot of scholarship about the scream, as you might guess. One is that that Munch himself had seen this archaeological exhibition. They had archaeologists out in Peru digging up Inca artifacts. And one of the things that they brought back for display in Europe was how the Inca had buried their dead inside of pottery. And so, as you might guess, this pottery, the tombs, the caskets, if you will, were very old. All the flesh deteriorated. And so you had these skeletons, and they were opening up these pots, these earthen coffins. And typically, this is what the skeletons were shaped. The pose that they had struck was like this: head, hands holding the head, and mouth dropped open, as though these skeletons were screaming from the grave. And so anyway, it was a real powerful image to Munch. And some have said that that is what inspired at least this part of this artwork. And so another thing, what we see happening here, (1890s), we see advances in everything. The world is a much different place between 1800 and 1899. Civilization had changed, at least Western civilization had changed dramatically. And as a result, there were new scientific discoveries. There were new disciplines. And among those disciplines was psychology. We see the advent of Sigmund Freud from Vienna, Austria. And the idea that the human mind is something that could be explained and studied. We take that for granted now. We know external factors play a part in shaping our personalities, our outlook, our behavior, our lives. We know that. That was a whole new thing 125 years ago. But we start to see this. We're starting to see this. People study this, and we start to understand that fear and anxiety, what we might call today PTSD. Of course, the study has advanced years, but we were beginning to understand psychology. And there was this whole realm of existence that had not really been addressed properly in art. We saw some of the romantic artists start to tip their toe in that pool. Like who? Eugene Delacroix, Insane Woman, parentheses, envy. The idea that they could paint, he could study her face and discern her personality and her mood. And I talked to you at the time about some of the other pseudosciences that predate psychology, like phrenology, measuring the head. But at any rate, the idea of studying the mind, and Freud came up with famously, how many of you had psychology? How many of you know about Haley, David? So if I were to say, what's the ego, the superego, and the id, you would know what that is? Okay, that's a theory that was proposed by Sigmund Freud. He said basically the human psyche, the human mind, your existence, your psychological makeup is divided into three parts. The ego, and that's your sense of self, and we still use that term a lot. If somebody has a big ego, they're self-satisfied, they think they're really cool, they're self-centered to the point where they don't consider anybody else. The id is our impulses, the things that drive us to do what we do, our basic instincts. And the superego is that part of the mind that's rational, that considers ourselves in the context of others as our place in society, as our place in humanity. Superego is responsible for scientific, mathematic, other kinds of thinking. And so anyway, the idea of digging into people's thoughts and people's fears was exceptionally fertile ground. And so this is the famous monk. He spent a lot of his life painting women. And it's said that he had a fear of women. And a lot of his paintings of women are not particularly flattering. But subject, object. Gustav Klimt from Vienna. The Kiss, this is pretty famous work too. Kind of digs in a little bit on the arts and crafts movement, all of the decorative stuff that I showed you. But on the other hand, it is about a psychological experience as well. Photography. Again, we'd seen some of this in painting. We saw Mary Cassatt, Bath, Earth More So. And so I think I'll end up, no, I want to show you this and I'll end up on architecture, but Auguste Rodin, sculpture in the age of Impressionism. His work was pretty much developed out of the age of Impressionism, but he is a guy who actually went to Italy and studied sculpture. And he found all of these famous, yet little publicized. Michelangelo, unfinished sculptures. We kind of took a little look at that when we were looking at this, but he's got walking man, but no head, no arms. Out of Michelangelo's unfinished sculpture. And the other thing is that he's got the essence of a walking man without every detail. And so they're the burghers of Calais, and these are the burghers. That's a kind of a ruling class. They were in Calais, which is a French city, and they had been vanquished by an army, and all of their leaders were sentenced to death. You see something like that going on in Ukraine right now. But at any rate, here they are, and they're extremely gestural. But what is so interesting about his work, and I think this is probably as good an illustration as any, you see the surfaces are not smooth. And as we talked about Monet and the Impressionists and the effects of light, Rodin deliberately made the surfaces textured so that they would reflect light in an entirely different sort of way. And so what Monet and the other Impressionists were painting, he was taking some of the behavior of light and incorporating that into three-dimensional art. And he's pretty much considered the sculptor of the era. And I showed you the arts and crafts, and I talked about the Tiffany eggs. This is a table lamp by Tiffany. And what we have at this time, as I've been saying, architecture is a clear indicator of technology and engineering of the age in which it was produced. Eiffel Tower, 1889. Famous landmark, still there, although it was made primarily for the World's Fair and was only expected to be up for 20 years. It became so well loved that they had to rebuild it some 20 years after this. But bottom line, it's the same thing. And it shows you what engineering could do at the time. And how can they do this? We got that high carbon steel that we start to see bridges and other buildings made of this steel. Eiffel took this to another extreme. This is taller than the arch. This is over 700 feet high. And so this was considered like one of the architectural wonders of the age. And I mentioned earlier that at the time, in the late 19th century, France, and especially Paris, was kind of the center of a lot of things. It was a center of scientific research. It was the center of artistic activity. It was the center of literature, philosophy, a lot of things happening in France. And as a matter of fact, there were a lot of Americans, like Mary Cassatt, attracted to France to get in on the cutting edge art of the age. And so this is the Eiffel Tower, and it comes out of that. And I wanted to show you this. This is here, St. Louis. We're in the textbook. This is a Wainwright building. It's on Chestnut and 9th, and I got this. It's a 10-story, 41-meter high terracotta building at 709 Chestnut Street in downtown St. Louis. The Wainwright building is considered to be one of the first aesthetically fully expressed early skyscraper, designed by Dankmar Alder and Louis Sullivan. And it was named after the investor and financier, Ellis Wainwright. Not Adam Wainwright, Ellis Wainwright. But yeah, and they still use it. And we got parking tickets in St. Louis and stuff. You would go here to pay your parking tickets. But technology, you know how they could build this? It's that same steel. what they figured out is if they made, and you can see, we still use this technology today. You see a building, a large building go up, you see it's got a skeleton. It's a bunch of steel beams, typically on the horizontal and the vertical. And they hold all the weight. They are the superstructure of the building. So you could put all of these windows and you could put all of this decoration here, but it is not weight bearing. What's holding it up is that Carnegie steel from Pittsburgh, and it is holding this up so you can do just about anything. You don't need the walls to hold themselves up, which is that's how things were before the 19th century. If you wanted a tall building, it'd be how many stone blocks could you stack up? How could you relieve some of the pressure, flying buttresses and so on? But this is, and St. Louis, I might add, during this time was a very important city. We don't quite see it that way today. It's kind of a nice place to be. I like it here. But 100 years ago, 130 years ago, St. Louis was a very important place. It was very wealthy. It actually was a center of manufacturing. You know, at the time, most of the shoes, or many of the shoes that people wore, were made in St. Louis. And part of that had to do with our situation, our geographic situation. And we would get all of those cow skins from the stockyards from the meat processors in places like Chicago. They'd send down all of that leather, and in St. Louis, they would make shoes. Famous for shoes, famous for beer. Whoa, we still kind of do that. Famous for a lot of things. And so the idea that one of the best examples of skyscrapers is right here should be of no surprise. So important was St. Louis that in 1904, we had the World's Fair. Still talk about it. It's where Forest Park is today, was where most of the fair was, and parts of Wash U and stuff. But not only was it the World's Fair, it was the Olympic Games of 1904 were in St. Louis. So probably time had taken its toll on St. Louis, and probably one of the last hurrahs of St. Louis was probably the Gateway Arch. Just still, like, technologically and aesthetically one of the great monuments people understand. So that being said, this is what you get. This is a newer one. This is in Chicago, Sullivan skyscraper. And so that's what I have for today. It's 6:12. You got about 2.5 minutes to ask me questions. No questions. You guys ready for quiz 4? Good. Good. So, got a week to do it. And I want you guys to, let me get my notes. What do I want you guys to do? Oh, yeah. Have a good weekend. Just say it. That's all I got. See you then. See you Monday.